Okay, in chapter 3, we're going to talk about the practice of environmental protection. So, in the last chapter, we had a few lectures on the underlying themes of environmental law and policy, those principles and concepts that seem to always be there: scientific uncertainty, mismatched skills, protected interests, cognitive biases, all these things that seem to be involved in all these environmental issues that make them so complicated and make the passing of legislation, the enforcement of legislation, the amendment of environmental legislation so difficult and so complex. And then today we're going to talk about the practice, applying this legislation. Um, and again, this course is focused on federal legislation, but we will talk about state issues and local issues as well. But we'll get into again, the practice of environmental protection. We'll talk a little bit about environmental protection pre-1960s, how the law was applied to protect ourselves from pollution, from environmental degradation, how to protect the ecosystem before there were large-scale environmental statutes that did that for us. We'll talk about internalizing externalities, which I've already introduced to you, and the administration of environmental law. So I'll list, basically give you a laundry list of different types of agencies, federal agencies, and their responsibility over certain statutes. So let's get right into this. Surveys have shown that about 80% of Americans believe in some sort of environmental protection, but only 2.5% of the gross national product is actually spent on environmental protection. And I mean, this may seem alarming, or it could, you may not be surprised. Really, there's all sorts of public policy trade-offs at work here. Why don't we spend more on the environment if the vast majority of Americans believe in some sort of protection, including doing something about climate change? Why don't we do more if there's so much support? Well, it's a difficult question to answer. We have politicians with different backgrounds. We have an infrastructure that may have to go through significant changes that would impact the economy. We balance our budget with national defense, with the economy, and with the environment, all these different things. And I don't think very many people would be willing to sacrifice money spent on national defense issues, for example, to go towards environmental issues, particularly if there's some type of uncertainty in regards to the efforts being made to protect the environment, that the trade-off would be worth it. And so, and also I want to bring out that you got to be very careful with statistics, particularly percentages, because in some cases it's not that expensive. So in the United States, we have some of the best environmental laws in the world, and we tend to enforce them fairly well. Because of that, we have cleaner air, cleaner water, healthier forests now than we did 40, 50 years ago. That's clear. The Endangered Species Act has been successful at restoring or at recovering nearly 30 different species. So these are great things. How expensive is that? We have vast expanses of wilderness areas, particularly out west, where land is protected and off limits to development and construction and road building and so forth. It doesn't cost that much to protect that land, because really once it's protected, and there's not a lot of enforcement needed. So the statistic may be a little bit biased. This came right out of the book, but it's important to understand these things. But the point that the book is trying to make is, for example, with climate change, why aren't we spending much, much more to change or shift our infrastructure away from coal and gasoline? If this many people are interested in that, why aren't we spending more to do that? Well, I suggest it's probably an infrastructure thing, what we're used to, and how do we adapt to that? So it's complicated solutions. And the precautionary principle is certainly in play here, and it seems like there's kind of a do nothing or do very little at this point, which is too bad. And there's all sorts of conflicting social values and national priorities. Who is wrong? Who is right? Does someone have to value environmental protection? Is that something you have to value? Well, of course not. You can value whatever you want to. Is there a right or wrong answer? Well, to some person, something that's right to somebody else may not be that important. So there's just all these conflicting biases and protected interests that come together to make it very complicated in answering this question and to explain this disparity between those two statistics. But let me give you some examples of some things that I think were um, pretty interesting, where society and environmental protection came together and they kind of saw things in the same light. So post Civil Wars, so this would be, so the Civil War ended in the 1860s. This was in the 1880s. There was the country was expanding, and the economy was booming, particularly in the north, and railways and canals and for transportation were expanding, particularly around the Great Lakes. And it was identified that there was a real need to protect the watershed that provided water for New York City. So Manhattan was growing considerably. The water supply was, coming from the Adirondacks, and there was concern that this could be jeopardized. And so back in the 1880s, there was discussion to protect this area, and the protection came later. I don't know that I have a date here. Oh, I do. Let's see. So state legislation. This is a state park. State legislation was passed in 1902, making Adirondack Park, that's this area in green here, a very huge, huge area. But it's an interesting park because 52% of it is privately owned, and there's 102 towns within this park, and there's roads and buildings and communities and all sorts of things in there. But collectively, that region is carefully managed to protect the water supply because it's the headwaters of so many watersheds. And this was foresight way back in the late 1800s to consider doing this. This was an area important to Theodore Roosevelt as well in the early 1900s. That it should be protected in one form or another, and it is. And you can buy a home up there, and you can go up there and do things. But there's certain codes that are or zoning that's set in this park to protect it for future generations and to protect the water supply. And you can see this is a very pristine portion of the park. This is one of those images that you can get, right off the internet there. But an amazing place. So here. This was a balance between all the protected interests and different biases that are out there, in which people came together to, a long time ago, before the environmental movement really took hold, to consider protecting this resource because it had value for everyone and everybody could see it, and it's still protected today. The next one is an interesting one, and I don't have all the details on this. I actually grew up not far from the Mountain Home Air Force Base in southwestern Idaho. This Air Force Base is about a little over an hour from, east of the capital city of Boise, out in the desert, the high desert. And it's an interesting story that I remember from my childhood during the first Gulf War. So the Air Force Base has a large bombing range south of the Air Force Base, and this is what it looks like. High desert, very remote, very dry, and it's full of canyons. In fact, there's two canyons, the Jawbridge Canyon and the Bruneau Canyon, and they're just quite amazing because you can go out across this flat landscape, and then all of a sudden it just drops down through these basaltic lava. These are ancient lava flows. And it drops down through, and then at the bottom of these canyons, straight down, there's a river. And it's really an amazing place. It's very remote, very much a desert wilderness. And there's a population of desert bighorn sheep that live in these canyons. Well, it's a great place for maneuvering aircraft and for training for warfare. And which obviously is very necessary, particularly in a time of war. You have to send the U.S. isn't going to send their pilots over into war unprepared, and so this is one of the places where I don't know if it's still an active Air Force bombing range, but it used to be. And this was back in the 90s. But what was happening was that a biologist studying the bighorn sheep, and there were biologists, state biologists and federal biologists, and biologists working with the military to monitor wildlife populations, and they found that the bighorn sheep population was crashing. They just weren't mating, and it was just this kind of this odd thing. It's like, why the heck aren't these sheep mating? They have good habitat. They're out in the middle of nowhere. What's going on? Well, biologists concluded that maneuvering during the mating season in particular areas was so distracting to these sheep that they wouldn't mate. And so the population began to decline. Well, the Air Force Base is very important to this region, particularly during the first Gulf War, when they were training pilots for combat missions, and so it was super important. And then all of a sudden, this article came out in the newspaper that basically pitted sheep against the U.S. military and national defense, and people got really angry, and it was really blown out of proportion. Usually people start reacting to things very quickly before they really know what's going on, and that's certainly what was happening. And it became those darn environmentalists think, wanting to protect sheep over the military, and this is this big problem, and we need to stop it. And so what had happened was actually the military and biologists were actually working together to figure out a solution. I don't think there was much of a conflict between the biologists involved in the military. It was more of a conflict of the perception that people in the public had over this issue, that they thought, in the article it said that, maneuvering was going to be restricted, and there was going to be all these reductions, and in which there was some actually. But people thought that, it was one or the other, and nobody thought to think that, well, we can do both, right? We can figure out something. And the military and federal and state biologists that's where they were going, was to figure out how to do both, because I don't think anybody thought that that the military on their own federal land would not be able to continue their maneuvers. So the solution was relatively easy. They identified where the sheep were, where they tend to gather during the mating season, where they mate, and when. And they collared some of these sheep with radio collars, and they tracked them, and they tagged them, and they did all this work. And it cost a lot of money, and it furthered the conflict. That all this effort was being put into sheep, and a lot of people were upset. But what they were doing is trying to figure out where these sheep were at, and at what time, and when they were most vulnerable. And then when they found that out, the military just shifted where they maneuvered. So they were still maneuvering. They were just maneuvering in different areas of the base. It's a huge bombing range, so they had other places that they could go where the sheep were not present. The biologists didn't know really quite where the population was spread out. Once they were empowered to do so, it empowered the military to, or the Air Force to change their the locations in which they maneuver, at least during the mating season, and the population began to recover. A fairly easy solution, but it's interesting, and the reason why I share this is that the public tends to react very quickly, very reactionary, very upset. How dare you? How dare you? When in reality, a very nice solution arose, and it arose pretty quickly. I think within a year they had kind of figured out how to resolve this problem, and it worked very well. Okay, so I want to talk now, and I won't be able to finish this portion before I run out of time. As you know, these little lectures are only about 15 minutes in length, but I want to talk about how the environment was protected, or how environmental protection existed prior to the 1960s, prior to the passing of all those environmental statutes that I showed you in the first lecture, or the second lecture. What was done, and the reality is there wasn't much environmental protection, and that was the problem, and that's why Theodore Roosevelt and others, Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, Barry Commoner, really rose into prominence, because they were demanding that there be some type of federal statute that protects us from ourselves and protects the ecosystem from human behavior as well. And prior to the 1960s, really, it took some pretty serious environmental degradation, as you see here, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, And it was really resolved in the courts through case law, through common law, because I'm running out of time. I'll stop this here, and then we'll start up in the next one.